Hello everyone and welcome to the Wiley webinar series. I'm Finn, your host for today's webinar, which is titled Diversity Drives Innovation, Representation in Research. The session will be presented by Dr. Madhu Bhaskaran, Professor and Research Leader at RMIT University. Professor Bhaskaran co-leads the Functional Materials and Microsystems Research Group at RMIT University. The discoveries made at micro and nano scales by the research group are transformed into prototypes, often in partnership with industry. Her work seeks to transform conventional hard electronics into soft and unbreakable products, thin enough to create electronic skin. She has won numerous awards and fellowships for her research, including the 2017 Eureka Prize for Outstanding Early Career Researcher, named one of Australia's most innovative engineers by Engineers Australia, and in 2018 she won the Batterham Medal and the APEC Aspire Prize. Today's webinar is expected to last a bit under an hour. The recording will be made available after the session via an email link. As always, we welcome questions from the audience. Please feel free to send through your questions anytime via the Ask a Question button located underneath the main video player, and stay with us till the end for the Q&A session. Now I'll pass it over to Dr. Bhaskaran to begin the presentation.
Thank you very much, Finn. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. Thank you so much to Wiley for this opportunity. So, as Finn introduced me, I'm a co-leader of the Functional Materials and Microsystems Research Group at RMIT University in Melbourne. Now, the topic of today is diversity drives innovation. So when we think about diversity, I think a lot of us are tuned automatically to think of diversity as gender diversity, but I'll make sure I go beyond gender diversity in my presentation. So what you see over there is a presentation structure. So I'll tell you a little bit about diversity and inclusion. Why are they important? I'll talk about my own research and then draw examples from the research and the collaborations which we have through the research to make the case for why diversity is so critical. I'll also touch on gender diversity, so where I'll talk about some global examples, especially in the academic sector for enhancing gender diversity, and also on some Australian examples. And what I plan to do towards the end is try and finish up on giving you some ideas on what you can do. So no matter where you sit in the STEM sector or at what career level you are at, there's something definitely which you can do towards enhancing diversity. So I'll try and see if I can give you some suggestions on what you can do to make this a better place in some sense. So what the slide shows you is how diversity leads to better decision making. So this is something which you'll find the minute you Google diversity and decision making, you will end up with multiple images like this or multiple studies like this. And it's a no-brainer in some sense. You don't need a graph to tell you this, but nevertheless, here it is. So if you have an all-male team, and generally you can see the numbers over there in terms of how quickly you reach a good decision and how the decision making is enhanced every time you enhance the diversity. And you can see over there, diversity is beyond gender. So you can have age-based diversity, and there can also be diversity based on geographic diversity. So as you enhance diversity, how the decision making is also enhanced is what this graph is trying to show you. So when you generally hear about the word diversity, you also hear about the word inclusion along it. And now for me, inclusion is as important or sometimes even more important than diversity. So diversity is obviously just making sure you collect people who represent different forms of diversity in together. So it's a bit like the puzzle of different colors. But inclusion is where you truly bring them together and harness the best of what you've got together. So diversity without inclusion is really meaningless because you don't really have a sense of belonging and you don't really contribute to the best of your abilities. So for instance, there's a common saying where they say diversity is being invited to the dance, but inclusion is actually being asked to dance. So making sure that you don't just focus on the diversity aspects, but when you're creating the workspace, there's a big focus on the inclusion as well, which in some cases or in most cases is actually the more difficult part of the puzzle. The diversity is a numbers game, whereas the inclusion is, the quality of what you actually have when you come together. So as I indicated earlier, diversity is not just about gender. There's much more diversity than just gender. So there's variations in thinking styles and perspectives which people bring. There's obviously ethnicity, religion, and cultural diversity as well, based on race or nationality. There's age-based diversity, and there's also sexual orientation diversity. So each of this can lend to better decision making. So when you talk about diversity, even though a lot of focus is placed on gender diversity nowadays, there's also all these other forms of diversity which you can consider. I'll spend the next few slides talking about my research, and that will kind of lay the context of where my collaborations come in and how we've actually worked together as a team. So as Finn introduced me, I lead the functional materials, I co-lead the functional materials and microsystems research group, the important word there also being co-lead. So we are three group leaders who lead the team together. And so what we essentially do is we focus on materials at the micro and the nano scales. Now we are basically a team is predominantly made of engineers, but we also have quite a few physicists and scientists and chemists in the team. And even though we are predominantly electronics engineers, there are quite a few biomedical engineers, materials engineers, chemical engineers also who work alongside in the team. So we work on materials at very, very tiny scales. And the fascinating thing about materials when you work with them at the micro or nano scale is they behave very differently at those scales, and you can use those to have wonderful applications. So we work with ultra-thin novel materials, typically 2D materials, and ultra-thin and very, very tiny vacuum scale electronic devices. We also work on devices for optics or for terahertz technology, so where we're trying to transform light and create the next generation of optical devices. We also work on brain mimicking devices, so devices which kind of mimic the electronic synapses in the brain. And a lot of our focus also is on stretchable and wearable sensor type devices, which is what I'll be talking more about and where a lot of our collaborations also come in. So what this slide kind of shows you is, how far wearable technology has come. So if you look at the word wearable technology, you might think it is a very recent thing which has actually hit the market. But in the true essence of the word, wearable technology has been around for quite a long time. So right from the calculator watches, which people used to have in their 70s, to hearing aids, which existed right from the 1980s, each of it is actually a piece of wearable technology. But when we look at this timeline, you can see, and when you look at the different pieces of technology in this timeline, you can see that, even though technology has become more miniaturized and more functional, there is still a bit of breakability about technology. It is not unbreakable. It's still sometimes a bit clunky, and sometimes when you drop it, sometimes they don't behave the same way as they behaved before you dropped it, for instance. And this, in essence, became the motivation for our work. So what we wanted to do was to create the next generation of electronics which are transparent and which are also unbreakable and which you can wear on your skin like electronic skin. So we obviously had innovation, we had to bring about innovation by overcoming some challenges in this space, because what we were trying to do was combine very, very different materials and try and create these electronics. So you have conventional electronics, which is a bit like the electronic chips, which are sitting inside the laptops or the tablets or the phones, which you might be using to view me right now. And inside each of those electronic chips, you usually have what are called oxide layers. Now, oxides are like glass-like materials, and these glass-like materials have wonderful properties, and they're quite versatile in the nature. Based on what they're made up of, the properties change. So it's a bit like the color glass, where the composition of the glass is giving you different colors. So very similar to that, the composition of the oxide layers gives you different applications. So what we want to do is, obviously, electronics has come a long way since the 1930s. So we didn't want to recreate a new class of electronics. We wanted to take the best of electronics, but try and render it stretchable or flexible. So when I say stretchable or flexible, what I mean is I want to use materials very similar to contact lenses. So you can imagine how thin that is. It's very skin-like in its properties, and it's very flexible and conformal as well. Now, it's not as straightforward because they both are very different materials. They have very different properties. Mechanically, they are different. Thermally, they are different as well. So we had to overcome a few challenges in that space and create this technology, which is what we did back in around 2015 or so. So what we managed to create, and you can see people holding it over there, is electronic chips with which are sitting within that silicone rubber type technology, which you can stretch and flex and bend and reuse. And this was fantastic. If this was a face-to-face session, I would have probably been sending around a few samples right now, so each of you could have interacted with the technology, because nothing, seeing is believing. But touching the actual technology really helps you understand it. But here are some more images which kind of show you what it looks like. So as you can see, it's extremely thin, it's transparent, it's just like contact lenses, but it has the electronics embedded within it. Now it's quite versatile, the platform, because you can change the layers which are sitting within this technology and change the end application. And that is exactly where we wanted to be. So we wanted to understand how we can take this and then pitch it to industry. And hopefully industry will then tell us what is the right way or the right market to actually pitch this as a product into. But while we were doing this, we wanted to make sure we bring a lot of people along with us on the journey. So obviously we have our core team, which are predominantly scientists and engineers, but we wanted a few other people with us in our journey and a few other people to talk to, because we really wanted to ensure we get those different perspectives while we make those decisions. So what this slide kind of shows you is our main collaborators in terms of collaborators outside of the STEM or the science or the engineering sectors. So we collaborate quite a lot with industry, and I'll talk to you a little bit about our industry collaborations in the next few slides. We collaborate with manufacturing partners as well, because what we find is a lot of us create a lot of engineering technologies which kind of sit within the lab, but they're not really easily upscalable. And for industry to take it up and to make thousands or 10,000s of products and sell them, it has to be manufacturing ready. So, and there is a big leap which has to happen between what is happening in the lab to what is actually being manufactured in a big facility. And so having those manufacturing partners early in on the journey and understanding those manufacturing challenges really helps you, to create better technology. There's also user-centric design. So when we create these things, we need to look at it from the user perspective. So say I'm creating a sensor which I want somebody to wear on their skin. How are they actually going to interact with that sensor? How are they going to choose that sensor? How are they actually going to use that sensor? And how are they actually going to get the information of that sensor? So we work with people in that space to make sure that we keep that perspective in mind as well as we work towards our product. And we also work with technologies such as a health transformation lab, where we're talking to a wide range of people. So you're not just talking to other scientists and engineers. We're also talking to the clinicians. We're talking to the people who are the pharmacists, the doctors, or people who are actually in the lobbying space within Parliament, where we are trying to make sure that the government understands what we're trying to do and they can support us on this journey. So I'll talk to you a little bit about cross-sector collaboration now. And when I say cross-sector, what I mean is predominantly I'm talking about industry in this case. So as a sector, we sit pretty much in the academic sector. So when I'm talking cross-sector, I mean the sector of industry in this particular case. So some of the industry collaborations we have for our work is in the aged care sector. Now, this is something which I definitely would not have envisioned. So if you had asked me, say, in 2014 or 2015, you're working on, skin-like sensors, where do you see yourself using this? I would have probably told you I can see myself this being used in healthcare. I don't think I ever envisioned that those sensors can find their way into aged care. So we had, this was in fact our very first industry collaboration. It started around in 2017. So we had a company called Sleep Tight who came and said, we've seen your technology. We see you talk about micro scale devices. You talk about nano sensors, but can you actually make them mattress scale? Can you make them to, can you incorporate those sensors within a mattress so that we can put that within aged care facilities? So the idea behind this is they wanted to take the sensors, upscale it, put it all across a mattress, and then deploy it within residential aged care facilities, so that overnight you have the ability to actually tell if a person is in bed or not in bed. Are they at risk of falling off from the bed? And also whether you can talk about their health or get information about their health while they sleep. Is their heart rate normal? Is their breathing rate normal? And if there are fluctuations in it, can you alarm the nurses who are looking after them so they can come in and intervene at the right time? Now, we work with Sleep Tight and also the manufacturing partner Sleep Easy on this particular piece of work. Another company who has approached us recently, again for the aged care sector, is a company called Lepus. Now, they were interested in actually taking our patches and putting them on people. So they want a little sensor patches which you can stick like Band-Aid onto the skin. And now that's going to monitor for the aged care person what their ECG is, what their skin temperature is, and also what their blood oxygenation levels are. Now, COVID has brought a lot of understanding around blood oxygenation, and I know a lot of people are constantly using oxygen meters to monitor their blood oxygen levels. But imagine if you could have a patch which you stick on your skin like a band-aid, and that's constantly doing the monitoring for you, and it'll alert you or it'll send you alarms when something is not looking quite right. So that's kind of the interesting project we work with on Blepis. So what are the considerations for a sector such as aged care? Now, very similar to the pandemic we're sitting in right now, which is global, aging is global too. I mean, people age all across the world, and we all want to age well. We all want to age productively. So why is aged care very, very different, from country to country? Why can't we borrow a few lessons and just use the same technology across the entire globe? Turns out there are cultural differences in the way we approach aging. So I remember for the first time when I went and presented this work and spoke about the Sleep Tight and Sleep Easy collaboration in Singapore. And the question I got asked there was, why do you want to go all the way of, putting in sensors within mattresses? Why don't we just have cameras in the room? And that will surely tell you whether that person is in bed or not in bed and if there are issues around it. I can never quite talk about a camera idea to an Australian audience or to a European audience. Privacy concerns, the concerns to have independence is extremely high over here, and people would rather forego a few years of their life rather than give up their privacy or their independence. So there's a huge cultural difference in the way people like to approach aging. For a few people, they don't mind being hooked up to devices. They don't mind, giving up a little bit of their privacy as long as you can ensure that they'll be safe. Whereas for a lot of other people, they want to continue living life as they always have lived. And so they never want to have something like this coming and intruding in on their privacy. There are also gender differences in, not just in aging, but in any technology which we can create for people. I'm not sure if you're aware, but a lot of the crash test dummies which are created in safety cars or the seat belts for safety cars, all of it is actually modeled on an average male of a particular height and a particular weight. Turns out cars and the crash tests are actually not as safe for women as they are for men. A lot of the modeling and a lot of work is actually done based on the safety of men, who's considered the average user, and a lot of it is actually not really considering women in the mix, who are not made up the same way as men are. The way our bodies are different, the weight distribution is different, the posture is different, and the height and weight inferences are different. So we kind of had to take that into account as well when we are designing a mattress for the aged care facilities. And obviously, manufacturability is what I mentioned earlier. So we're making devices at the micro and the nano scale. How can we make sure that we can actually make them macro scale, which is mattress size, and still retain the functionality and the reliability of the sensors? And there's also user interactions. So for a project like the one which we have at Blepis, where we're putting the patch on the person's body, how do we make sure that the person's comfortable wearing that patch and they don't, and you have people who have dementia. We also, have a lot of aged care residents who have dementia. How do we make sure that we don't confuse them by putting a patch on them and therefore, lead to, problems in the long term? So these are all considerations which kind of come from the conversations we have with people with very different perspectives and very different experiences. And that's a really valuable conversation to have very, very early in this technology pipeline rather than have these considerations much later down the track. The next set of examples I'm giving you is, again, with our sensors, a few other places where we deploy them is we work in the health sector especially. So we work with a company called Nutromics. And what Nutromics are trying to do is trying to create personalized diet solutions. So what we're creating with Nutromics is a patch which you can wear on your skin, but it has a microneedle array, which is kind of monitoring your interstitial fluid, which is under your skin, and trying to monitor the glucose levels in your body all through the day. Now, we all consume food all through the day, and we all think certain foods are bad and certain foods are good, but turns out we're all different. And the way we all process food is extremely different. So what might cause a glucose spike for one single person may not cause a glucose spike for another person. So in the hope of preventing early onset of diabetes and giving you better choices to make and having you better informed about your diet choices, that's the entire idea behind the Nutromics patch. And similarly, the sensors can also be used for UV sensing. So that is something which we are working with quite a few other companies, because UV is particularly a cause of a lot of problems such as skin cancer, but you also need a certain dosage of UV every day to produce vitamin D in your body. So how do you make sure that you get the right amount of UV dosage, but you don't get too much of it that it's going to cause health concerns? So some of our sensors are also being deployed as UV sensors with industry partners. So when you look at these kind of issues, again, there are various considerations to be made. Just talking about UV in continuation, we are all different. As you can imagine, our skin tones are quite different. And as you can see in that little graph over there on the left, each of us require a different amount of UV to produce vitamin D based on our skin tone. And at the same time, each of our skin tone also dictates how sensitive we are to UV-induced damage. So tanning occurs at different rates for different people based on their skin tone. But when we create a UV sensor, we need to make sure that it alerts them at the right level and at the right time based on their skin tone consideration. It's not a one size fits all. One particular UV sensor cannot serve the entire market. Skin tone and other considerations have to be taken into account when we are creating a sensor for the market. And similarly, when we are trying to create a product like the one we're creating for Nutromics, where we have needle patches going into the skin, thickness of the skin becomes quite an important consideration. And guess what? There are differences in the thickness of the skin based on gender. Men generally have thicker skin compared to women, which also ages very differently. And the thickness of the skin is different on different parts of the body. So these are the kind of considerations which need to come quite early in on the cycle, so that we make sure that we account for those while we create that technology. I'll talk a little bit about cross-disciplinary collaboration now. And when I'm saying cross-disciplinary, I don't mean just collaborations between science and engineering or between science and health sciences. That happens, and that is something I'm guessing I'm almost taking it as a given. I guess I'm talking about disciplinary, which goes beyond the STEM sector. So I'll be talking about collaborations we have with the design sector and how those collaborations also dictate quite a lot of the choices we make during our work with this particular electronic skin work. So I'm introducing Leah in this particular case. So Leah is actually the co-director of the RMIT Wearables and Sensing Network. And Leah is not an engineer. So Leah, who works with us quite closely, she's actually coming from the design perspective. So she's a design lecturer. And the next couple of slides has a few of the technologies Leah has developed. We didn't have anything to do with this. I wish we had, because they're beautiful pieces of work. But what you see in this image, believe it or not, are actually hearing aids. So they're almost jewelry-like in their appearance. They are modular hearing aids, which were created to make sure that people are not conscious about wearing hearing aids. You almost treat it like a fashion accessory. You're proud to wear a hearing aid, and it's almost like a thing to flaunt. So Leah worked quite closely with the engineers creating the hearing aid, and this device is actually called the Facet. It's modular, which is the world's first modular hearing aid. And what really set off Leah's imagination was actually the crystal or the mineralogy collection she saw at Museums Victoria. So as you can see over there, it has a lot of crystalline facets, and it's quite metallic in its colors as well, which is offered. And so this is some of the wonderful collaboration between design and engineers and how it can result in a beautiful looking product. I have a few more examples on the next slide as well, which is on Leah also works with other engineers and partners on creating emotional technologies. So you can see some examples over here. Again, each of these look almost like pieces of art, but that's the entire idea behind wearable technology. It's not just about creating technology which collects information of you or which you can just put on you, but they're almost like pieces of jewelry or pieces of art which you feel proud wearing, which you feel nice to wear on an everyday basis, and which you really feel is a significant add-on to your entire lifestyle. So for instance, there's a cat pin over there which monitors a person's loneliness. So this was again something which she was trying to pitch towards people in the aged care sector, where they don't have too many positive social interactions in a day, and that can enhance the feeling of loneliness. So that little cat pin is actually monitoring your social interactions on a day-to-day basis and trying to ensure that you have enough positive interactions every day, and therefore you keep loneliness at bay. So quite a lot of fascinating examples over there. So the next couple of slides, I'll talk to you about how we actually work quite closely with Leah. So we work with Leah on quite a few of our industry projects, but this particular one, I'm just focusing on the Nutromics example. So as I said, with the Nutromics, the idea behind it is you have a little patch which sits on your skin, which has microneedles, and those microneedles are piercing your skin to study the interstitial fluid which is present below your skin for glucose variations. So Leah helped us to actually design that patch. So if you're wearing a patch on your skin, what do you actually want it to look like? What is the encasing material of that patch? How is it actually going to sit on your skin, and how is it actually going to look? And when a user actually interacts with the patch, what is the kind of information they can get off that patch? So these are some of the work which we did with Leah in the design of the actual patch itself. But the other interesting thing where we also work with Leah is we do what are called user case studies. So what we are doing in this case is almost imagining what happens when say this product is ready, it's in market, how is a person actually going to buy the product and use it? So she creates an example and she does interviews in this particular thing. So what this kind of shows you is there's a person who's going to the doctor. The doctor has basically told her that he's very concerned about her health, and they would like them to go and buy this Nutromic Smart Patch so that it can inform them about the choices they make while they're eating and whether it's spiking their glucose levels, and so to keep a lookout for diabetes. So this person buys the patch, she goes home, she puts on the patch, and then when next time she eats something, she uses the patch with her mobile phone and tries and tracks her glucose levels after every diet choices she's making through the day. Now, after a month, this person's feeling much more confident about making better choices for themselves, and hopefully that way trying to keep diabetes away from them for as much longer as they can. So it's an interesting way to look at it, because we as engineers and scientists, sometimes we're thinking about, is the patch doing what it's doing? Is it collecting the right amount of data? Is it sensitive? Is it repeatable? Is it reusable? We don't sometimes, take the product all the way to the market, and we don't think about the user actually interacting with the product, who look at it from a very different perspective. So having that diverse thought processes right from the start of the journey has been really, really useful to us to change the way we are actually thinking and approaching this entire thing. I leave the research-based discussions over there at that point and focus on gender diversity over the next few slides. So as I mentioned, when you say diversity, for a lot of people just take it for granted it's predominantly gender-based. And to be honest, there's a lot of work which is predominantly being done around gender-based diversity. So if I'm not sure how much the audience is across the numbers, but the numbers don't look good for gender diversity in STEM. So it depends on how you count this, so whether you look at STEM with the added M. So STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Sometimes there's a double M at the end of STEM, where the second M stands for medicine. So you might consider medicine, you may not consider medicine, and based on that, the numbers look a bit different. But generally, there's only around 30% of women in sciences. And again, depending on whether you're looking at researchers, or are you looking at industry, or are you looking at cross-sector, again, the numbers look a bit different. So I'm predominantly talking about the academic sector, because that's where most of my experiences are. And so you will see the numbers look pretty much the same in that kind of a space. So it's around 30% of scientific and technological researchers are women. And I think there's been a lot of research going into why are the numbers so low? What is the problem? And why is it only 30%? And the 30% is not a constant number. So there are a lot more people at the start of their career, and towards the end of the career or in leadership positions, you have far fewer women left in the pipeline. So we did some work last year through a Women in STEM decadal plan. I'll talk a little bit about that a little more in detail later. But what this graph shows you over there is a career progression pipeline, and what are the various barriers women face at different points in their career, which causes them to actually leave the sector or leave STEM and walk away from the whole thing. And that could be, lack of understanding, lack of role models, lack of flexibility when they actually have career interruptions, actual career interruptions or caring responsibilities, bias, discrimination, racism. Each of these are actually barriers which prevent women from progressing down the pipeline. So Athena Swan is actually a UK-based charter, and so I'm not sure how much people are across Athena Swan, but this was a very prominent program which started in 2005. And the idea behind this was to make sure that gender diversity has to be addressed. We can no longer just pretend the problem does not exist, and that has to be addressed at the organization level. And so they came up with this in around 2005. Now, it's obviously been 15 years since the program started. It's been immensely successful in the academic and education sectors, where every organization has been forced to go through this entire measure to make sure they're doing something about this problem. So it has 10 principles. I've just kind of zoomed in on those principles over there so you can have a better read of them. But this has a particular gender focus. So a focus is pretty much on women and gender focus. But I think slowly there have been other forms of diversity which have been taken into account as well. But essentially, what each organization is committing to is to have an understanding of where the problems sit and commit to actually making positive changes so that these problems don't perpetuate for generations and generations. So how do you tackle the gender pay gap? How do you make sure women are well supported down their career journey? How do you make sure women make it to the boardroom positions and leadership positions? And how do you make sure that you remove all the obstacles which people face along their journey? Continuing on, so how do you make sure that you retain women? You also help their career progression. Make sure there's no discriminatory treatment against women, and also making sure that you put in place changes which makes it a much more inclusive workplace. So not just focusing on the diversity, but focusing on the inclusion as well. So it started in 2005, and every organization was invited to make an application. But where it really turned things around for the UK was when one of the granting bodies, which was the National Health Foundation in UK, basically said, we're not going to take applications from any university or an organization which has not gone through the Athena Swan program and has not got a silver rating based on the program. So that really turned things around because it meant people had to take notice now. People had to make a difference. You could no longer sit down on your hands pretending the problem didn't exist. So people had to start making positive changes and therefore keep applying for bronze or silver or gold ratings once in every 5 years and make sure they keep improving on their situation. So it was not enough if you just made slight improvements and then sat on it. You had to constantly keep working on it and constantly keep demonstrating that you're making improvements in the sector. And every time, and as you can see over there, the success rate is not very high. Just because you make an application, it does not mean you're going to get a bronze rating or a silver rating. You had to keep working hard to make sure you keep at it. So it made a lot of positive change for women in the sector across the UK. And since then, other countries around the world have slowly tried and seen if they can adapt this particular format for their own countries as well. So I'll focus now on the Australian sector, which is where I'm from. So if you look at the numbers in Australia, they don't look great. They look just as bad as the rest of the world. To be perfectly honest, we did the Women in STEM decadal plan last year, and when we looked at the numbers, Australia actually looks, in terms of actually the women getting into STEM, the numbers are actually far worse than India and China. India and China don't have an issue in attracting girls to do STEM. The issues rise and emerge at certain other points down the career track. But then getting girls to actually come in and do STEM is not a particular problem or concern, especially in India or China, where it's nearly 50-50, or sometimes there are more girls than boys actually doing STEM in India or China. So in Australia, it looks particularly bad. The numbers are not so great, especially, and STEM is actually quite broad. Even though we say sometimes 30% or 25%, if you look at engineering and specific, the numbers are even more bad. And certain branches of engineering, the numbers are in fact pathetic. So it's a global problem all over the world, but it's not uniformly distributed problem. It really depends which particular sector you're looking at and which particular branch of STEM you're looking at. So that's just the Australian numbers in a snapshot. We are 50-50 Australian population-wise. So Australia's population is 50% women, 50% men. Bearing in mind, this is just looking at two genders. Obviously, now there are more than two genders, but this looking at it at a very two-gendered outlook. But the Australia's workforce is actually 47.5% women, but actually the STEM-skilled workforce is only 16% women. So we have a real problem in actually attracting girls, young girls, to come in and do STEM. So that is one of the problems which we clearly identified as part of Women in STEM Decadal Plan. So the Women in STEM Decadal Plan was a plan which was put forward by the government last year. Now, the idea behind this is we give ourselves 10 years to try and make changes in this space. 10 years because it is going to take that much or probably even longer to actually make positive changes in this space. It's not a problem which can go away overnight. You cannot fix this overnight. It requires a lot of concerted effort across every level in the organization, across a long time duration, to make sure we are making changes for the future generations. So, and we can no longer ignore it because almost all future jobs, almost 70% of future jobs are going to use STEM skills. And so we can no longer ignore the problem and not have a big chunk of our workforce who don't have STEM skills. So what we identified through the decadal plan was we have 10 years and we have 6 opportunities. Now, the decadal plan is a bit different to other plans because it involves a lot of sectors. So we're not just talking academia, we're talking government, we're also talking schools as well as businesses and industries. So it's a multi-sector plan which runs across for 10 years, and there are 6 main opportunities we identified where a lot of work could be put in. Now you can see on that slide over there, the 6 opportunities are listed. So we start off with leadership and cohesion. So as I mentioned, women make it up the scale, but not all of them actually make it all the way up to leadership positions. So why is it we don't have as many women making it up to leadership positions? And so we want to make sure that concerted effort is put in promoting women and giving women, positions of power and authority, which will make sure that diversity is represented across the entire career. Second thing which is listed over there is evaluation. So evaluation is basically where we all do, diversity programs, but how often do we go back and actually check whether they are working? So we actually found there are 300 different diversity programs which run across Australia, but only 3% of them are actually even checking back to see if they're working or not. So we run diversity programs, we go to schools, we do a lot of, outreach in schools, but do we actually know what is working and what is worth putting time and money and effort into? So evaluation is quite key in making sure we spend our resources quite wisely. Then there's the workplace culture, which kind of, ties back to the inclusion, where we can enhance the diversity, but we need to make sure the workplaces are as inclusive and respectful as well. Then there's visibility. So visibility is, like the word says, it's making sure that women are very equally represented across and very visibly seen in public events, in medias, in classrooms, in boardrooms. The very common thing which you hear is you cannot be what you cannot see. So for women and young girls to have positive role models, visibility is particularly important to solve in this particular challenge. Then there's education, which is essentially talking about schools. So making sure that the schools, the teachers, the career counselors are well supported to ensure that they encourage girls to take up STEM as a career. And the last one is the industry, which is where we make sure that industries and businesses also make sure that they address the gender-related issues as well. There are a few other Australian initiatives. So there's a Male Champions of Change, which is essentially we completely acknowledge that this is not a women's problem, it's a people's problem. And so there's no point in women alone solving this problem. We need to ensure that all genders come along on this and solve the problem together. So the Male Champions of Change is where the male leaders in Australia have come together to make sure that they are also a part of the solution for this particular problem, and they implement changes at the highest levels of leadership to make sure the change happens quickly. And it's also cultural change, it's not just other changes. Then there's SAGE, which is the Australian equivalent of the Athena Swan, which I mentioned earlier. The Superstars of STEM, which is a very nice program where they put out a call and they actually take around 40 to 60 women in every round, and they give them media training, they give them a lot of visibility, and they ensure that they have a network to speak to each other to, and they actually set them up for success at the end of it. And then the last one is also STEM Women, which is actually a database. You can actually go and search and find women across who work in different STEM fields across Australia. So if you're ever looking for a conference speaker, if you're ever looking for somebody to go and have on a panel, this is a vital database for us to go and actually find and get the right expertise, but try and find women whom we generally can't find to represent in these kind of, panels or conferences. At the last couple of slides, I just thought I'll talk about what you can do. So you've listened to me, go on about diversity for a long time. Hopefully, I've convinced you that this is important and that change has to be done. So what each of you can do is obviously champion change in this particular space. So each of us are needed. And like I mentioned earlier, it's not a women's problem. It's a people's problem. It's a business problem. So and obviously diversity is much more than gender. And so we need to make sure that these things are accounted for as early as we can, so that we're set up for success. One important thing is inclusive language. And I think we find that we do that quite often in the education sector, especially in STEM. Like, I'll give you an example. So when we submit a journal article and we get a review, right? So when we talk about the reviewer, we generally tend to address the reviewer as a he. I think, and we had to make sure that our students say not he. A reviewer is not always a he, it could be a she. So I think people used to say she or he, but then now we're also talking about gender diverse people and LGBTQIA plus community. So now the accepted pronoun has become they. So pronouns are critically important because they help in that enhanced sense of, inclusion. So make sure you use the right pronouns when you address people, or when you don't know, the best is to use they and not he or she. There's team building. So each of you, no matter what your career level is, one day you will set up a team. And obviously, I'm hoping some of these points resonate for you at that point, to make sure that you set up a team where inclusion is practiced. So meeting timings, for instance, is key. So making sure you don't hold meetings first thing in the morning at, say, 8 o'clock, or at beyond 5 o'clock in the evening, so that you account for those people who have school drop-offs, or they have other responsibilities which they need to cater to, typically at around 9 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the evening. So most meetings which are held in Australia now are held between the hours of 10 o'clock and 4 o'clock, just to make sure that we have that inclusion, and you don't need to have people missing out in the meeting because of life things, like such as going and doing school pickups or drop-offs. Recruitment obviously is quite important. So with recruitment, and each of these points I make over here, there are pages and pages you can read about them. I'm just trying to alert you to them. So with recruitment, making sure the panels take into account the individual circumstances of the applicants. The panels need to be balanced to account for any bias which might be present. You can obviously undergo bias training to do better recruitment, but these are all the things which come into recruitment, as well as grant assessments. So when you assess somebody's grant, making sure you account for those career interruptions in their career. So say there are 2 track records put in front of you, and one person's had a maternity career break, they're not obviously the same. So how do you make sure that you take into account those kind of interruptions, take into account, other interruptions which might be present, and you take that into account into your decision making. When I go back to the previous slide, and I kind of wanted to cover one thing on that one. Not sure if it's actually made its transition. Just give me a minute. Okay, so in this slide, I just want to talk about that little image over there. So that image is quite nice because it talks about equality, equity, and then removing the barrier. So the first image on the left is showing you equality, where everyone's given a little step stool to stand on to watch the particular sporting activity. This image in the middle is representing equity, where it actually understands that not everybody is the same, and some people need a little more boost to actually, get to the same end outcome. And the third one is interesting because essentially they've removed the barrier in place. So people no longer need to be considered for equality and equity reasons. There are no more barriers to be considered in that particular space. And I think the third image is where we are hoping we can work towards, where we remove all the barriers. And so, everything becomes much more balanced in that case. Now, continuing on to what you can do. So I've spoken about collaborations, and I'm hoping you can understand there are a lot of careful choices which can be made with collaborations, which can significantly enhance your perspectives and thought processes. Conferences and workshops. So again, like I mentioned about the STEM database, you will all be organizing conferences. You will all organize workshops. You will all organize panels. How do you make sure that you have a balance in speakers? Trust me, the first thing we all do when we think about inviting speakers, we try to think of 5 names. And more often than not, it's almost 5 names, which are typically men or people we've always heard talking to in these kind of sessions. So making sure that you bring that balance in speakers every time you plan a particular event becomes critically important for visibility. And visibility, like I mentioned earlier, making sure that your team has the right mix of people, and you give all of them equal opportunity, and make sure that they all are put forward as core team members of your particular team. The last one is, of course, staying authentic. I think we're getting to that point where we're all being appreciated for truly who we are. So making sure that we bring our whole self to work, stay authentic, and bring those unique experiences each of us have to decision making and to our everyday work. Before I finish up, that's the team which I lead. We started off as a team of 2 back in 2010. So it's been 10 years since we formed the group. And as you can see, the team has been slowly growing. It's a team predominantly made of PhD students and postdocs. So the composition of the team keeps changing once in every 2 or 3 years. But really proud to lead a team where we come across, I think we are 6 or 7 different countries. Obviously, we're trying to reach gender balance, which is quite tricky to reach in engineering field. But we try and bring together people together and try and create an inclusive workspace for them on a day-to-day basis. Those are the acknowledgements, the various funding bodies, and that's the most recent team photo, which was taken just at the end of last year. And that's pretty much it from me. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bhaskara. That was great. I think we have time for a couple of questions. The first one that's come in, what are some tips to foster good communication within a diverse team?
That's a good one. So one thing which we do within our group is we actually have an expectations document. So the first meeting which we have with anybody new who comes and joins our team is we've actually created an expectations document on what the person can expect of us and what we expect of them. It's just a one-pager, but it really sets the scene in terms of, where we'd like to be as a team and hopefully brings everybody together on that same balance, on the same level, in making sure that everyone's on the same level in what the expectations are of them. Communication is definitely key. A lot of problems which occur are because of lack of communication. So we use various online platforms which ensure we're all part of the same project and we can all have visibility across, what each of us are talking about or what each of us are doing. So these are some things which kind of help our team, not to say that doesn't still result in issues which need to be resolved, but I think it's definitely help us, not have a lot of the other problems which might commonly have come up otherwise.
Yeah, great. Another question, do you have any tips for implementing diversity initiatives?
That's a hard one. I think it really depends on what you're looking to implement the diversity initiative in, right? I mean, it could be an organization, it could be a team, it could be a conference. And that in turn is going to really dictate where you start off from. But I think keeping it in mind right from the beginning is really important. A lot of people kind of realize it too late. So keeping in mind that diversity is something which has to be taken into account right from the very beginning is quite important. There's a lot of resources out there, and it's amazing how much Google can find you. So, feel free to read about it, talk to other people who you think have done the right thing and get tips off them. The common thing which we say is we had a conference, I think, a couple of months back around gender diversity and making sure we're doing all the right things. And they said this is one place where you can openly steal ideas, borrow ideas as much as you need, because when one of us wins, we all win in this particular thing. It's not a competition. So there's no harm in, implementing an idea which has been implemented somewhere else as long as it works.
Yeah, great. Another question, how can one make sure that diversity initiatives are actually working?
So it kind of goes back to the evaluation which I mentioned. And it was an interesting thing which we found when we did the decadal plan, because we found 330 initiatives. That was the total number of initiatives which were done across the country in people hoping to boost diversity. And when we went around asking the 330 people, okay, so how do you know yours is working? You've been doing it for 5 or 6 years now. How do you actually know yours has been working? A lot of people haven't even bothered to go back and actually find out if what they're doing is actually leaving an impact or not. We found only 3% actually been evaluating whether their thing has been working. So one of the things which recently the Australian Women in STEM ambassador has put out over here is an evaluation framework. So it's an open tool. I'm sure all of you can find it. So if you can actually go and find Australia Women in STEM ambassador evaluation toolkit, it comes up with various ideas and by ways of which you can actually check if that particular idea you floated or the particular initiative which you ran, how can you go and make sure that it actually made a difference? So how do you evaluate either immediately after the event or at a particular time fraction after the event, whether it's actually made a positive difference? So I think evaluation is very critical, and it makes sure that you use your resources quite nicely by actually evaluating quite regularly.
Right. I think we have time for one more question. When you've experienced some of the things you're talking about as far as gender diversity and other things like that, how have you dealt with them personally?
I think I'll put it this way. I'm not from Australia. I'm actually from India. So I came to Australia in 2004. I came to basically do a master's degree. And when I came here, I think what I found being in engineering, and full kudos to my male colleagues and the other colleagues I worked with. Luckily enough, I never felt quite different. I never felt I was the only woman in the room, or my decision making or the way I'm being viewed is a bit different because I'm a woman. I have developed a thick skin. I have developed, but there are certain things which might have bothered me when I was younger, which doesn't bother me anymore. But I think at the same time, what we're trying to do is make sure that we don't go around telling women, you need to fix yourself because the system will not fix itself. And that is the entire idea behind all these gender initiatives. We're trying to make sure we fix the system and not fix the women, because we shouldn't have to develop very thick skins to deal with it. But a little bit of perseverance and a little bit of resilience, I think really, really helps. Get your perspectives right and focus on what's really important and try and ignore the other ones which are not so important. But as you rise to leadership positions, you realize that you shouldn't just keep walking past behavior which you don't approve of. So once you get to certain positions in your career, when you have the ability and the authority to call out behavior which is not so good, I think that's when we really need to start stepping up and try and start doing the right thing. We are all not always in a position where we can call out bad behavior or step in and do something right, but we do reach a position later on in our career when we can, and I think that's when we all should really be stepping up and doing it.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Okay, I think that's probably all the time we have. Dr. Bhaskaran, did you have anything to add before we wrap up?
No, I'm good. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again for that presentation, and thank you to the audience for joining us today. I hope you found this session useful and informative. Have a great day, and we'll see you all at our next webinar.